Have you ever wondered why some people effortlessly stick to their goals, while others struggle just to get started? Imagine waking up with genuine excitement, feeling laser-focused throughout your day, and being able to tackle challenges head-on without hesitation. In today's video, you're about to uncover powerful science-backed strategies that transform discipline from a dreaded chore into a natural, enjoyable part of your everyday life. Whether you're aiming to boost your productivity, enhance your health, or simply find more balance, these easy-to-apply insights, like simple morning routines and small lifestyle tweaks, can create dramatic changes. Stick around till the end, because the last few tips could be the game changer you've been searching for. If you love practical life wisdom that truly works, make sure to subscribe. Now join our community and never miss another insightful video again. Limbic friction is a term that describes the profound sense of resistance we sometimes experience when we try to initiate action, even if that action is in our best interest. This resistance can arise in many common situations, such as when the alarm goes off and we would rather stay in bed, or when we feel compelled to procrastinate instead of tackling our to-do list. The scientific perspective, as discussed in the conversation that informs this text, frames limbic friction as a kind of tug-of-war between the deeper, more automatic parts of our brain and the top-down control systems that can override these urges. Top-down control is often associated with conscious willpower or discipline, the cognitive processes by which we say, "I may feel tired, but I'm going to stand up and do this anyway." This notion of friction is intimately tied to our biology. We have evolutionary drives that prioritize seeking comfort, conserving energy, and safeguarding our immediate well-being. In many ways, it has helped humans survive by minimizing unnecessary exertion. Nevertheless, in the modern environment, goals often require consistent effort, which clashes with these deeply ingrained tendencies. Consequently, we must rely on the higher-order parts of our brain regions heavily involved in planning future thinking and self-regulation to push through. Andrew Huberman, who is at the center of this conversation, describes this mechanism of forcing oneself to act in spite of resistance as top-down control. Essentially, the prefrontal cortex, which is the more recently evolved part of our brain, has to overrule signals emanating from more primal limbic structures. An everyday illustration could be the promise you make to a friend that you will drive them to the airport early in the morning. When your alarm rings at 5:00 a.m., the limbic system quickly checks in with your immediate state. Are you warm under the covers? Are you still tired? If so, it naturally suggests you ignore that alarm rollover and go back to sleep. Top-down control, however, comes from your rational mind, reminding you that you gave your word and that you value reliability. So you get up anyway. In the discussion, it's emphasized that such a decision can be powered by different emotional tones. Some people might do it out of love for a friend, others might do it out of a sense of duty or personal pride, and yet others may even tap into anger to fuel the action. The emotional flavor is less important than the act of overriding the friction itself. What underlies this override ability biologically is the mobilization of certain neurochemicals, chiefly adrenaline, also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine, along with dopamine. When you force yourself to move against the grain of your initial desire, your body's alertness systems kick in, and you essentially rewire your brain over time to become more resilient to those stay-in-bed signals. In other words, every time you consciously power through a moment of friction, you incrementally strengthen neural pathways that make you better at handling future difficulties. This is why even small acts of self-discipline can have a compounding effect over a lifetime, fostering an identity of someone who does what needs to be done. It should also be noted that an individual's capacity for top-down control can vary based on many factors, including overall health, sleep quality, stress levels, and genetic predispositions. People who are well-rested have more mental and physical resources to push through friction. By contrast, when you are sleep-deprived, it can feel impossible to muster the strength for the simplest tasks. This dynamic underscores an essential theme: biology and mindset work together. Simply trying to will yourself to be disciplined while ignoring foundational aspects of wellness, such as quality sleep, can lead to inconsistent results. In the conversation, Andrew Huberman points out that individuals like David Goggins exemplify this concept spectacularly. They have, through repeated practice, become intimately familiar with the sensation of friction and the subsequent internal narrative of overriding it. They trust there is a win on the other side, often a sense of accomplishment or a knowledge that they have continued to keep a promise to themselves. Over time, that trust shortens the gap between the desire to quit and the actual execution of disciplined action. This bridging of the gap, fueled by a future reward, is in part a dopamine-driven process. Each time you override friction, you build confidence in the inevitability of the win, which in turn makes it easier to override friction the next time. By analyzing this concept more deeply, we discover that learning to override limbic friction is not simply about developing willpower in some generic sense. It involves a rewiring of neural circuitry that interprets the discomfort of friction as a precursor to something meaningful. Repetition is crucial. With each instance, the friction becomes more tolerable, and eventually the mind adapts to expect a positive result from pushing through. Thus, discipline is a skill. It can be taught, learned, and refined. Dopamine's central role in motivation has been studied extensively, and one of the crucial insights is that dopamine is not merely released at the point of reward, but also when we anticipate that something rewarding is going to happen. In other words, your body and brain can learn to treat the promise of a reward as if it were already in progress. This psychological shift, translating a distant future benefit into a felt sense of excitement, now is one key to developing strong discipline. When you anticipate a future payoff, dopamine levels begin to rise preemptively, which boosts your willingness to put forth effort in the present moment. The conversation references a scientific paper that underscores how delayed gratification is governed by dopamine mechanisms. Delayed gratification typically means resisting smaller, immediate rewards in exchange for larger rewards down the line, like putting money into a long-term investment rather than splurging right away, or choosing to work out instead of watching TV because you want better health in the future. Research shows that if you perceive the ultimate outcome as worth it, your brain can be trained to release dopamine earlier in the cycle of effort, effectively rewarding you. Now for a result you'll only see later. This process connects directly to overriding limbic friction. Suppose you wake up at dawn to train for a marathon. In the early days, when you haven't developed the habit, your brain is more attuned to immediate discomfort. Fatigue, aching muscles, the warmth of your bed you just left behind. Over time, though, if you consistently remind yourself of the finish line, both literally and figuratively, your dopamine system starts to adapt. It begins to drip dopamine into your system the moment your alarm goes off, because it has learned you'll be feeling that runner's high or sense of pride eventually. Essentially, you have taught your brain that waking up early equals future win, so it supports you chemically in the present. An important part of this phenomenon is that individuals differ in how naturally they can conjure this kind of anticipation. Some do it with positive emotions, like love for a craft or a powerful sense of excitement, while others might dig into negative emotions like anger or defiance. Andrew Huberman illustrates that from a neurobiological standpoint, the flavor of your motivation is less critical than the presence of a strong internal push to override friction. Whether you do it out of love or out of anger doesn't dramatically change the fundamental mechanism. Your prefrontal cortex is stamping out impulses that say, not now, aided by a dopamine bump that says, yes now, because a payoff is coming. David Goggins, for instance, seems to have cultivated a near unbreakable trust in that delayed win. He recognizes that the friction-filled moment will pass and the feeling of achievement or self-mastery will arrive if he endures. By repeating this day in and day out, he's built a narrative and a neurological framework where suffering is tightly linked with reward. This might not mean it's pleasant, but it does mean his brain is adept at toggling into that override mode. For most people who struggle with discipline, the stumbling block often lies in not believing strongly enough in the future reward, or not having experienced that reward often enough to trust it. If your internal narrative is, I never see real results, your brain won't be as willing to give you that anticipatory dopamine. Thus, a fundamental component of building discipline is constructing and reinforcing a believable path between your present effort and a genuinely valued future outcome. That path essentially tells your brain, give me the dopamine now, because the payoff is coming. Over time and with practice, this can dramatically lessen limbic friction. Top-down mechanisms, sometimes simply referred to as willpower, are subjective experiences, but follow a fairly standard neurological script. They are triggered by the prefrontal cortex, a region responsible for executive functions such as planning, inhibition of impulses, and directing attention. The conversation highlights how different people use different emotional or cognitive tools to fuel this top-down control. Some rely on their sense of identity, e.g., I said I would do it, so I must because my word is who I am. Others might call upon a sense of duty, responsibility, or moral principle. Still others use frustration or anger as an internal spark to push themselves forward. In psychological terms, none of these approaches are necessarily superior or inferior, as long as they reliably lead you to act. What matters for building discipline is consistency and congruence, so that over many repetitions, your behavior leads to the neural adaptation you desire. Essentially, your chosen mechanism becomes a well-worn path that you can access in moments of friction. But the conversation also makes a key point. The reason so many of us falter when we try to be disciplined is that we do not rest enough. Willpower is energetically expensive. If you deploy it constantly without periods of recovery, you risk burning out. Another piece of the puzzle is that top-down control does not merely apply to forced wake-ups or resisting junk food. It can also be essential for resisting other impulses, such as anger in a heated argument or the desire to indulge in distractions like social media. The repeated successful use of willpower in different domains can strengthen the global sense that I am someone who can override immediate impulses. Conversely, repeated failures can feed a story that I can't control myself, which can become self-fulfilling. This interplay highlights that discipline is not just about single instances, but about patterns that create identity. Likewise, the conversation underlines that there is an inevitable push and pull between instant gratification and higher-order, future-focused behaviors. Our species evolved to seek immediate rewards for survival like quick energy from high-calorie food or relief from cold, yet the forward evolution of human civilization has depended on individuals who push beyond the immediate. Elon Musk aiming to go to Mars, or explorers seeking new continents centuries ago, did not do so because it was comfortable. They did it by continuously overriding, or at the very least negotiating with their immediate desires. When people consider themselves lacking in discipline, one of the first questions might be, am I giving myself enough future wins to believe in, or am I always chasing short-term victories? The conversation suggests a re-education of the mind may be needed. You begin by setting smaller challenges, ones that stretch you beyond your comfort, but not so large that they feel impossible and reinforce the link between friction and reward. Over time, you build confidence, and those dopamine circuits learn to light up sooner, bridging the gap more efficiently. Huberman's neuroscience perspective is clear at a physiological level. These top-down processes hinge on the interplay between alertness, fueled by norepinephrine and dopamine, and rest states which allow neural circuits to solidify. If you are always on, eventually the system breaks. Willpower might spike temporarily, but fails to sustain. Thus, an essential part of growing your top-down control is balancing these states so you can repeatedly practice pushing through friction without depleting your mind and body. David Goggins is frequently cited as a personification of extreme discipline, someone who, through repeated feats of endurance and relentless training, seems to have developed an ability to override almost any kind of physical or psychological discomfort. While not everyone will embark on ultra-marathons or punishing workouts daily, the principle he embodies can be applied across many areas of life. Huberman speculates that Goggins has become so intimately familiar with the friction narrative, acknowledging it, yet still overriding it, that this process has turned into a reflex. This discussion highlights the practical insight that you do not have to love the friction. In fact, Goggins often talks about how the hardest days never truly become easy. Rather, he has learned to tolerate them, maybe even glean a sense of purpose from them because he trusts the payoff on the other side. This trust is not blind optimism, it is founded on cumulative experience. Every day that he has suffered through a workout has led to a tangible result. Be it improved fitness, mental resilience, or the deeper knowledge that he can handle adversity. Huberman points out that the rest of us can internalize this principle by consciously reminding ourselves of past wins whenever friction arises. The first few times we force ourselves out of bed onto the treadmill or into a difficult work assignment, the immediate payoff might be small. Yet over time, the satisfaction of completing a session or receiving positive feedback at work adds up, creating a track record. When faced with friction again, the brain can scan that record and say, this is the part where I want to quit, but I know if I push on, I will feel better in the end. That memory-based expectation is precisely what triggers the dopamine release in anticipation, lessening the subjective intensity of friction. Nevertheless, it is crucial to understand that some days, even with a robust store of discipline, friction might feel insurmountable. Everyone has off days, and various factors like insufficient sleep, emotional turmoil, or physical illness can amplify that friction. The conversation suggests that in these moments the best approach is to scale back to a smaller victory rather than abandon the mission entirely. For instance, instead of a 10-mile run, maybe do a 2-mile walk or a few push-ups. The key is not to strengthen the habit of quitting, but to maintain continuity of action. A subtle point here is the difference between ignoring friction and overriding it. Ignoring friction can sometimes mean running away from the discomfort by distraction or denial. Overriding it, on the other hand, acknowledges the discomfort and still makes a conscious choice to act. For long-term discipline development, this distinction is important. One fosters awareness and respect for one's limitations and potential. The other might lead to burying signals that could be critical for your well-being. Finally, the conversation extends the principle beyond physical challenges to intellectual or emotional ones. Individuals who consistently override friction in mental tasks, for example, focusing on a challenging math problem, finishing a difficult creative project, or having that tough conversation, are leveraging the same neural pathways. The more you practice it, the more adept your brain becomes at releasing the chemicals that help you push through. Eventually, you might find yourself relatively unruffled by tasks that once seemed daunting. Overriding friction becomes second nature, allowing for remarkable personal growth in any field of endeavor. One intriguing aspect of our dopamine system is how sensitive it is to the timing and predictability of rewards. Andrew Huberman alludes to how consistent, predictable rewards actually diminish the overall dopamine response in the long run, leading to reduced motivation. This is why casinos thrive on intermittent, unpredictable rewards. When you don't know if the next bet or the next slot machine pull will lead to a jackpot, your dopamine system is on high alert, fueling continued engagement. In practical terms, you can leverage this principle by introducing randomness or variation into your own reward structure. For example, if you're diligently studying or working in 90-minute focused sessions, you might not always reward yourself in the exact same manner or at the exact same time. Sometimes you pause at 30 minutes to sip a cup of coffee. Other times you might work straight through to 60 minutes before taking a stretch break. Occasionally, you might push the entire 90 minutes without any break, then reward yourself with a short walk outside. This technique keeps your brain from adapting too strictly to a pattern, ensuring that each reward remains potent. However, the conversation advises caution in layering too many dopamine sources. Imagine you only feel motivated to work out if the conditions are perfect. You've had 8 hours of sleep, it's a beautiful sunny day, your favorite music is blasting, you just drank a pre-workout supplement, and you know your workout buddy will be there to cheer you on. All these elements can create a massive dopamine release, making the activity feel fantastic, but they also raise the baseline of what you need to engage. Once those factors are missing, you may struggle to muster the same enthusiasm. Thus, a better strategy might be occasionally denying yourself one or more of these layered rewards. Maybe sometimes you work out in silence with no music, or do a study session without coffee. It can feel more challenging, but the next time you add back in a motivational layer, you get a bigger boost. Over the long haul, this cyclical approach can help keep your overall motivation more robust and less dependent on ideal circumstances. The conversation then delves into the darker side of overstimulation. Modern technology allows almost infinite access to high-stimulus content, whether it's junk food, high-adrenaline entertainment, or explicit materials online. The more intense and continuous the stimulation, the more your baseline dopamine levels can be affected. This can make ordinary experiences like a simple meal or a calm conversation feel dull because your brain has been conditioned to expect high-intensity hits of pleasure or novelty. To safeguard your motivation and discipline, it's imperative to practice some form of moderation or structured variability in how you give yourself rewards. Overstimulation leads to a situation where individuals continuously seek the next novelty to get a dopamine fix. The conversation specifically points to social media as a common culprit. You open your phone for a quick check, then find yourself scrolling endlessly. Each new post or video provides a tiny, almost negligible dopamine hit, but your brain keeps hoping the next piece of content will be the big reward. Before you know it, minutes or hours have evaporated. One risk here is that your dopamine system becomes blunted. In essence, you have hammered it with so many tiny stimuli that it becomes harder and harder for natural real-world experiences to register as pleasurable or motivational. You may find everyday tasks like reading a physical book or having a face-to-face conversation less engaging. This phenomenon isn't an indictment of technology itself. Social media and digital tools can be harnessed for education and connection, but the conversation emphasizes the importance of mindful usage. Andrew Huberman points out that if you are scrolling without even knowing what you're looking for, it's a sure sign you should step away. Once you cross that threshold where the search is aimless, your dopamine system is in a loop of chasing, and you'll likely feel hollow afterward, not energized. The remedy might be taking a break from social media altogether, sometimes just a few hours, sometimes a few days to let your brain's reward pathways recalibrate. Another facet discussed is how visual stimuli, especially moving images, powerfully hijack attention. Historically, humans did not have constant access to such rapidly shifting contexts. Even television was limited by schedules and channels, and certainly not portable in one's pocket at all times. The sheer volume and variety of stimuli now available can overwhelm our attentional systems, which evolved to focus on one or a few things at a time. This mismatch can lead to restlessness, making it difficult to stay motivated in real-world tasks that don't change as quickly. By the same token, pornography has been highlighted as another source of high-intensity stimulation that can warp expectations and lead to difficulties in real-life intimacy. It provides a potent surge of dopamine that can set an unrealistic baseline for arousal and satisfaction. People might then find normal sexual experiences underwhelming, which in turn can decrease motivation to engage with real-life connection. The conversation here carefully avoids moral judgments, but from a purely neurological standpoint, it's critical to recognize the parallels. Excessive and unrealistic stimulation disrupts dopamine homeostasis. Pragmatically, this is a call to be aware of how often and how intensely we stimulate ourselves. Just as important as taking breaks is learning how to enjoy smaller, more naturalistic rewards: a healthy meal, a walk in the park, a chat with a friend without feeling bored. It is in the in-between spaces, those everyday experiences, that much of our psychological well-being resides. By curbing overstimulation, we preserve our capacity to be motivated by ordinary life, which is key to maintaining discipline across long spans of time. A recurring theme in the conversation is the critical role of sleep. Sleep deficits directly weaken top-down control by degrading the neural circuits and hormonal balances that govern alertness and willpower. When people suffer from even one night of suboptimal rest, they often report feeling foggy or unable to sustain attention. This impairment ties back to the basic biology of how our brains recover and consolidate memory during sleep. Research on ADHD has shown that individuals with attention challenges sometimes have an uncanny ability to hyper-focus when they find an activity genuinely compelling. Their struggle arises when tasks feel uninteresting or mundane, as the brain's reward systems fail to provide enough of a dopamine signal to maintain focus. Ritalin and Adderall, commonly prescribed for ADHD, work largely by boosting dopamine and norepinephrine in the synapses, which aids the user in sustaining mental effort. Yet for people who do not have ADHD, the principle remains. If you lack internal motivation, the friction to focus will be immense. This is why meaningful engagement with your tasks, or finding ways to generate meaningful engagement, makes discipline smoother. Huberman references tactics like scruffing yourself, essentially viewing your own behavior in the third person, or using self-talk to say, "I don't like this, but I am going to wrestle it to the ground academically or practically." It may sound simple, but it is a technique that harnesses top-down control by tapping an emotional drive, even if it's frustration toward the material or the situation. The conversation also underlines how environment can compound or alleviate brain fog. Temperature, oxygen levels, and background noise all affect one's ability to remain alert. If you are sitting in a stuffy, overheated room while listening to a monotonous voice, it is almost natural to drift off. Conversely, stepping outside into fresh air or adjusting your position can jolt the nervous system into a more attentive state. Small environmental hacks, like these, though seemingly trivial, can accumulate to make discipline more accessible in daily life. Ultimately, the dialogue suggests that if you genuinely want to cultivate better concentration and discipline, you must start with the foundation: enough quality sleep. There is no hack, supplement, or motivational speech that can fully compensate for a chronically sleep-deprived brain. Once you're getting regular, restful sleep, it becomes far easier to engage top-down control and override limbic friction. Further, consistent rest also enhances your capacity to learn new skills, because your brain needs downtime to reorganize synapses and strengthen neural pathways. In summary, Part 1 of this expanded article has covered the nature of limbic friction, the science behind overriding it through top-down control, the essential role of dopamine in anticipating rewards, how random or intermittent rewards maintain motivation, and the importance of mitigating overstimulation. We have also touched on the interplay between disciplined environment and adequate sleep. The conversation is far-reaching, and at its core, it reminds us that discipline is a learnable skill that hinges on both mind and body working in harmony. While the theories of limbic friction and top-down control might seem abstract, real-life anecdotes ground them in day-to-day behavior. Andrew Huberman shares a personal example. He and his partner decided to jump in the ocean early one morning. Upon waking, it was rainy and chilly, and his immediate thought was that the water would be unbearably cold. Nonetheless, he had previously set the intention to do it effectively, planting a motivational anchor in his mind. By the time they arrived at the beach, that initial friction, "I hate cold water," still existed, but the planned action propelled him to override it. Once he actually got in, the water proved warmer than the air temperature, turning the experience into an invigorating wake-up call rather than a torturous ordeal. This story encapsulates a microcosm of discipline. First, you set a goal or plan when you're in a calm, logical state of mind like the night before. Then, when the moment arrives and limbic friction appears, you remind yourself of that previous commitment. Because the plan is anchored in a vision of reward, whether that is an energizing rush, a sense of accomplishment, or simply the knowledge that you kept your promise, your brain is more willing to release the neurochemicals needed to push past the resistance. Moreover, such experiences help recalibrate your baseline sense of what is achievable. If you told someone who despises cold water that they needed to jump into the ocean on a brisk, rainy morning, the friction could be so high that it becomes overwhelming. However, if you inch up to that challenge by taking cooler showers at home or immersing your hands and feet in cold water to get used to the sensation, you build tolerance. These small steps, repeated over time, adjust not only the physiological response to cold, but also the psychological narrative of what you can handle. Huberman's key takeaway is not that everyone needs to jump into cold water at the crack of dawn. Rather, it's a blueprint for tackling tasks that we anticipate will be uncomfortable. By pre-committing visualizing the payoff and taking incremental steps if necessary, you create a mental pathway that leads to action rather than avoidance. Each win strengthens the neural networks responsible for discipline, making future friction feel more manageable. The conversation also emphasizes that such top-down control should be used strategically. Doing something extremely taxing just once in a while might be exhilarating, but overloading yourself repeatedly without adequate rest can lead to burnout or injury. Similarly, if every daily task is approached with the same high-stakes intensity, the nervous system can become fatigued. Much like an athlete who periodizes training, individuals looking to build discipline benefit from alternating between states of intense effort and deliberate recovery. Huberman provides the gym environment as a prime illustration of how modern life is filled with potential dopamine layers. You might consume caffeine or a pre-workout supplement, listen to your favorite high-energy playlist, work out in a well-lit, lively gym. Perhaps receive encouragement from friends or trainers and relish the immediate gratification of muscle pumps and endorphin rushes. While this approach can give you a fantastic workout experience, it simultaneously raises your baseline for satisfaction. The next time you go to the gym without music, or if you have to exercise alone in a less appealing setting, you might find it significantly harder to muster the same level of enthusiasm. To avoid becoming dependent on these stacked stimulants, Huberman suggests occasionally removing one or more layers. For instance, you might choose to skip the music or the pre-workout supplement every third or fourth workout. At first, this can feel like a step backward because you notice the friction more. However, the upside is that when you reintroduce those layers, like playing your favorite playlist during the next session, you experience a renewed sense of excitement and motivation. This cyclical approach helps keep your dopamine response fresh and malleable. The conversation posits that if you constantly need multiple forms of stimulation just to feel normal, you may already be in the territory of what could be called addictive patterns. Your brain is no longer excited by these stimuli. It merely seeks them to escape withdrawal. For instance, daily reliance on high-caffeine energy drinks can reach a point where you consume them simply to feel baseline alertness, rather than to gain an actual edge. The same principle applies to social media usage, where repeated exposure can rewire your reward circuits to expect novelty at a pace real life cannot match. From a broader perspective, the capacity to practice discipline is about learning to function effectively, even optimally, under varying conditions, not just the perfect scenario. This adaptability is crucial because life rarely presents us with perfect circumstances. Whether it's an unexpected workload, traveling without our usual workout gear, or confronting personal problems that sap our focus, being flexible in how we trigger our internal motivation is a cornerstone of resilient discipline. Ultimately, layering dopamine in moderation is not inherently bad. Many world-class athletes and performers utilize a combination of music, caffeine, supportive environments, and social encouragement to enhance their performance. The conversation's essential warning is that if these are always present, you risk plateauing your dopamine circuits. By strategically removing them at times, you regain the ability to earn that dopamine high, thus sharpening your capacity for disciplined action when conditions are not ideal. A sobering example discussed in the conversation is the widespread accessibility of pornography and its impact on dopamine and real-world experiences. Andrew Huberman points out that pornography, which is now more visually and thematically intense than ever before, can train the brain to become aroused primarily by watching other people in explicit scenarios rather than by engaging in real, reciprocal intimacy. This repeated pattern can lead to a form of dopamine dysregulation where an individual becomes dependent on specific, high-intensity stimuli to achieve arousal. The troubling side effect is that everyday romantic encounters, which unfold more gradually and involve emotional nuance, may feel comparatively underwhelming. If someone has regularly consumed extremely stimulating content, their baseline dopamine response to normal human interaction can drop. This leads to difficulty in forming genuine connections and can create performance or intimacy challenges. Essentially, the brain has become calibrated to a level of novelty and explicit imagery that reality cannot easily replicate. Huberman draws a parallel to highly palatable processed foods. If your taste buds have adjusted to extremely sweet, salty, and fatty meals, a simple, wholesome dish can taste bland. Your ability to derive pleasure from subtle flavors deteriorates. Likewise, in the realm of sexual or emotional engagement, your capacity to find satisfaction in natural experiences diminishes when bombarded by artificially intense stimulation. This can spiral into a cycle of seeking out even more extreme content to feel the same rush, further pulling you away from real-life connections. The neurological theme here is that dopamine is a finite resource in terms of how intensely and how frequently it can spike before homeostatic mechanisms kick in to reduce receptor sensitivity. The brain's overarching goal is always to maintain balance. When one consistently floods themselves with supernormal stimuli, be it pornography, junk food, or a combination of social media hits, the brain adapts by lowering the baseline. This adaptation means you need more and more stimulation just to feel normal, let alone pleasurable excitement. The conversation does not condemn exploring sexuality or personal pleasure. Instead, it highlights the importance of conscious awareness and balance. Pornography, like social media or intense gaming, can become a trap when used habitually or as a primary source of stimulation. Understanding how these patterns shape our dopamine circuitry can help people make informed choices, such as moderating consumption, seeking genuine human relationships, or periodically resetting by abstaining for a period to let dopamine levels and responsiveness normalize. Social media operates on a principle of high-speed context switching. You can scroll through a mind-boggling variety of content, funny memes, breaking news, personal updates from friends, curated travel photos, all within a matter of minutes. Huberman explains that this barrage of newness taps into your brain's novelty-seeking circuits, which are partly driven by dopamine. Each swipe or refresh has the potential to reveal something exciting or shocking, perpetuating a cycle of just one more scroll. The downside, however, is that your attention span can be drastically shortened. In a real-world setting, listening to a lecture or reading an in-depth article, your brain may find the pace comparatively slow and unengaging. If you become accustomed to hyper-fast context, switching normal tasks, which often require sustained focus on a single subject, begin to feel monotonous. This is how the cycle of dopamine-driven overstimulation fosters an inability or unwillingness to remain patient with activities that lack immediate novelty. Huberman mentions an all-too-common sight, people browsing their phones even in social situations, looking for that next interesting snippet of content. This behavior reflects the immediate gratification loop reinforced by the dopamine system. Once your brain learns, it can get quick hits of novelty from your device, focusing on real life, which unfolds at a slower, more linear pace, becomes less rewarding. One solution is deliberate digital minimalism, a practice of setting boundaries like not looking at your phone first thing in the morning or turning it off during meals. Another is scheduling social media time, treating it as an activity with clear start and end times, rather than a background process that never stops. Additionally, you might reduce the visual intensity of your phone usage by lowering screen brightness, muting notifications, or even switching to grayscale to tone down the constant visual assault. The conversation draws parallels between the intermittent reward schedule of social media feeds and the design of casino slot machines. Both rely on variable reinforcement to keep users hooked. Sometimes you see something that makes you laugh or gives you important news. Other times you see nothing of note, but you keep scrolling in hopes of that next surge of excitement. Recognizing this psychological mechanism is the first step to regaining control. The second step is putting meaningful strategies in place to reduce the dopamine chasing that fuels compulsive use. Caffeine is the world's most popular psychoactive substance, with an estimated 90% of adults consuming it daily. Huberman details how caffeine works primarily by blocking adenosine receptors in the brain. Adenosine accumulates over the course of the day, making you feel tired. When caffeine prevents adenosine from binding to these receptors, you experience increased alertness. However, once caffeine wears off, any accumulated adenosine can surge in intensifying fatigue and causing the so-called caffeine crash. The conversation addresses whether daily caffeine use is detrimental. Generally, moderate consumption, particularly if it does not induce anxiety or disrupt sleep, seems safe for most adults. Huberman's main recommendation is to avoid caffeine within 8 to 10 hours of bedtime to ensure it does not impair your sleep architecture, especially deep and REM phases. Sleep disruptions, even if subtle, can manifest as reduced next-day alertness or a compromised ability to handle stress. An important nuance is that many people use caffeine daily merely to get back to baseline rather than to attain a true performance boost. If you want caffeine to genuinely enhance your cognitive or physical abilities, the conversation suggests occasionally cycling off. This can be done by reducing intake for a few days, then abstaining completely for a day or two, allowing the brain's chemistry to reset slightly. When you reintroduce caffeine afterward, it provides a noticeable effect above your normal baseline. The same cyclical principle applies to other stimulants, including nicotine or certain nootropics. If you rely on them every single day, your body and brain adapt and the net benefit may dwindle to zero. However, if used sporadically or in a carefully managed pattern, they can remain potent tools. Huberman acknowledges that this is a matter of personal choice and discipline. Some individuals prefer a steady but moderate caffeine intake, without major fluctuations, valuing consistency over occasional spikes in performance. Yet tying this back to the overarching theme of discipline, being mindful of how substances impact your dopamine and energy level, is vital. If your morning routine hinges on a jumbo coffee, simply to feel awake, you might want to explore adjusting your sleep schedule or morning habits to ensure you're not building a new form of limbic friction. By maintaining some level of restraint in cycling, you preserve your body's sensitivity to stimulants, making them more impactful when genuinely needed. Huberman underscores a critical insight into how the brain learns new skills or information. True neuroplasticity, meaning the actual rewiring of neural circuits, takes place in two main stages. First, you have a focused, active learning session where your brain is receiving new information or practicing new tasks. Second, you need a period of deep rest or sleep to consolidate those changes. During deep sleep and sometimes in non-sleep deep rest, NSDR protocols like certain meditation or relaxation techniques, your brain replays neural patterns associated with the learning. If you're trying to acquire a new language, for example, the conversation suggests you start with a 90-minute bout of intense, focused study. You concentrate on vocabulary grammar or pronunciation drills, giving your brain the stimuli it needs to mark these patterns. Critical to this process is the release of acetylcholine in the relevant neural circuits, which flags them for potential reinforcement later. Dopamine and norepinephrine also contribute to maintaining alertness and motivations during this phase. Then comes consolidation. If you never get sufficient rest after these learning sessions, the newly formed neural pathways remain fragile. The brain's cleaning and memory formation processes, which primarily occur during deep and REM sleep, are crucial to transferring what you studied from short-term to long-term storage. This phenomenon also applies to physical skill development. Athletes who incorporate naps or NSDR sessions can see faster improvements because these quiet periods allow the brain to replay the motor patterns more efficiently. One practical tip from the conversation is to take mini-gaps during your learning session. Every so often you might pause for about 10 seconds and let your mind idle. Studies show that these micro breaks can induce rapid replay of what you just practiced, speeding up learning consolidation. Additionally, if you can manage a 20 to 30-minute nap or NSDR session within a few hours of focused work, you stand to gain an extra boost in skill retention. The conversation draws a contrast with constant doping of the brain using caffeine stimulants, or even emotional states like anger or hyperexcitement to sustain focus. You can indeed learn or work like that, but if you never insert sufficient rest periods, your gains remain incomplete. In essence, you're propping up the system artificially without giving it space to solidify. Thus, the idea is not to demonize stimulants or high-intensity emotions, but to balance them with deliberate pauses so your brain can integrate what it has experienced. A recurring theme in this entire dialogue is the importance of toggling between forward-leaning effort and deliberate disengagement. Simply grinding from morning until night is not only unsustainable, but counterproductive in the long run. The conversation makes an analogy to athletic training, just as muscles need rest days to repair and grow stronger. The brain needs intervals of lower activity or different types of engagement to process information and replenish neurotransmitters. Andrew Huberman talks about the concept of a 90-minute ultradian rhythm for cognitive work, advocating for a structured approach where you engage in deep work for that period, followed by a break. During these breaks, you might do something active, like a quick walk or engage in NSDR or mindfulness exercises. The goal is not to idle the entire day away, but to ensure that each burst of productivity is fully supported by physiological readiness. Individuals who ignore this cycle often end up feeling perpetually stressed. They might rely on multiple cups of coffee or other stimulants to push through the natural lulls in their energy. Over time, this can desensitize the system, leading to higher stress hormones like cortisol, poor sleep, and a general feeling of malaise. By contrast, those who master the engage-disengage pattern can often accomplish more in fewer overall hours because their periods of focus are so effective. Tying this to discipline, it becomes apparent that mental and physical resilience are linked. The ability to override limbic friction in a healthy, sustainable way requires you to manage your energy levels intelligently. When you do so, you can apply yourself intensely during the times you're meant to work and switch off guilt-free when it's time to rest. This cycle also reduces the risk of burnout, which can sabotage long-term goals more effectively than any shortcoming in willpower. Part 2 of this expanded article thus explores how practical examples and specific strategies like setting up morning challenges, balancing dopamine sources, understanding the dark sides of overstimulation, managing caffeine intake, and employing a two-stage learning process converge to reinforce disciplined behavior. The underlying message is that discipline is not merely about pushing hard all the time. It's equally about creating the conditions, both internal and external, that allow you to push hard effectively when you choose. Continuing from the discussion on the two-stage process of learning, it's worth emphasizing the specific utility of non-sleep deep rest, NSDR, or short naps. The conversation reveals that even a brief 20 to 30-minute period of deep relaxation, especially within a few hours of a focused learning session, can enhance memory consolidation. This is because during NSDR, the brain replays recently activated neural circuits at high speed, effectively giving you extra practice repetitions without you consciously doing anything. What's interesting is how this insight aligns with anecdotal observations. Individuals who slip into short naps after studying or practicing a physical skill often wake up feeling like they have a better grasp on the material or movement. The neuroscientific explanation is that the hippocampus and cortex are engaging in a transfer of information, reactivating the neural patterns that were stimulated. This reactivation process is crucial for transforming what you learn from short-term memory into more stable, long-term storage. Additionally, implementing gap learning within a single study or practice session can yield dividends. Let's say you're doing a 60-minute block of cognitive work or motor skill training. Every so often, maybe at random intervals, you pause for 10 seconds to let your brain idle. Research cited in the conversation shows that these micro-gaps can accelerate the brain's assimilation of what it has just been working on. Rather than powering through continuously, you allow a quick replay to occur. The practical takeaway is that you don't necessarily need marathon sessions of unbroken focus. While long periods of immersion can be beneficial, sprinkling in these micro-gaps may help you learn faster and maintain a higher overall energy level. This concept parallels a larger theme of toggling between engagement and recovery. Whether the gap is 10 seconds, 10 minutes, or a 20-minute NSDR session, building deliberate pauses into your routine can amplify your capacity to persist in discipline-driven behaviors. The conversation also addresses the mental barriers some people feel. If I take a break, I might lose momentum, or I have to keep going until I'm done. But ironically, that approach may hamper learning if it causes mental fatigue. By working in synergy with your natural rhythms and employing strategic rest, you can optimize both the quantity and quality of your output. Discipline, therefore, is not about punishing yourself with endless toiling. It's about wisely orchestrating your mental and physical resources for sustained success. Anticipation remains a central theme. Neuroscientifically, the ability to derive dopamine from a future outcome is what transforms discipline from a grueling ordeal into a more manageable challenge. The conversation reiterates that some people rely on positive emotions to fuel this anticipation, while others tap into negative emotions like anger or frustration without necessarily producing adverse outcomes. What remains important is that you hold a clear image of the reward that awaits on the other side of friction. In tandem with anticipation is the concept of random or intermittent reinforcement schedules. Huberman notes that if every study session workout or act of discipline always delivered a big predictable dopamine spike, your brain would eventually reduce the level of dopamine it releases in response. Over time, the same reward leads to diminishing returns. This phenomenon explains why people who see quick dramatic success in some endeavor can lose interest once they adapt to that level of achievement. Conversely, building in elements of surprise can keep your motivational systems primed. In the context of exercise, you might occasionally allow yourself an indulgent treat or a particularly fun workout class, but not on a predictable schedule. At other times, you push through a mundane or more challenging routine without external perks. This technique mirrors the psychological hooks in video games or gambling, but here it is used deliberately for self-improvement. You create a system where you don't always know exactly when the treat will come, so your dopamine system stays alert. It's crucial not to confuse random reinforcement with randomness in your goals. Your larger objectives, say, running a marathon or learning a new language, should remain fixed, giving you a clear, stable direction. Randomness in this context refers to the way you grant yourself small doses of extra positive reinforcement. Whether it's a day off, a decadent meal, or a more intense but thrilling type of workout, vary the pattern of how you reward yourself. This approach can mitigate the pitfalls of overfamiliarity and keep your discipline engine fueled for the long run. While this might sound manipulative or contrived from a neurological perspective, it's simply working with the grain of human biology. Our brains evolved to remain alert to potential gains and losses in a world filled with unpredictability. By orchestrating small doses of controlled unpredictability, we can harness a system that otherwise might push us toward less adaptive behaviors, like procrastinating or binge-watching shows. If done ethically and with a healthy sense of self-awareness, random reinforcement can be a powerful tool for sustained motivation. No matter how well you manipulate dopamine and adrenaline during the day, inadequate or poor quality sleep will sabotage your efforts. The conversation returns repeatedly to the notion that a well-rested individual is simply more capable of exercising top-down control. Being deprived of sleep can amplify perceived friction because even minor tasks feel exponentially more draining when your nervous system is not fully restored. Andrew Huberman emphasizes the importance of seeing good sleep as a daily, non-negotiable ritual rather than an optional add-on. He suggests starting with exposure to morning sunlight as soon as possible after waking because natural light sets your circadian clock. Bright daylight hitting the photoreceptors in your eyes triggers a cascade of hormonal and neuronal responses, leading to healthier cortisol peaks early in the day and timely melatonin release at night. If you wake up before sunrise, turning on bright indoor lights is a reasonable substitute until you can step outside for that critical natural light exposure. By also catching some afternoon or early evening sunlight, you inoculate yourself against the melatonin-suppressing effect of screens and artificial lighting at night. This is because afternoon light fine-tunes the sensitivity of your retinal cells, making them less likely to derail your circadian rhythm when exposed to artificial light later on. Of course, you should still be mindful about indoor lighting in the evening. Dim your overhead lights, reduce screen brightness, or wear blue-blocking glasses if you find bright screens disturb your sleep. Additionally, Huberman points out that while some individuals claim they can drink coffee right before bed and still sleep, the brain's sleep architecture is likely impacted, reducing the quality of deep or REM sleep. Over time, this diminishes the restorative function of sleep. Therefore, cutting off caffeine 8 to 12 hours before bedtime is recommended for most adults, though personal tolerance can vary. In essence, discipline is at its strongest when your body isn't grappling with chronic exhaustion. Quality sleep sets the stage for healthier neurotransmitter levels and more effective emotional regulation, ensuring that when limbic friction appears, you have the mental clarity and energy to override it. Discipline is often conflated with forcing yourself to do things against your will, but the conversation underscores that physiology can be harnessed to make the process smoother. Simple techniques such as physiological sighs can rapidly reduce stress. This involves taking a double inhale through the nose, followed by a long extended exhale through the mouth. The second inhale helps fully inflate tiny sacs in the lungs' alveoli, improving oxygen exchange, which can help calm the nervous system almost immediately. Breathwork and short bouts of movement can also serve as quick resets when you feel friction rising. For instance, if you sense yourself procrastinating at the start of a work session, stand up. Do a brief set of jumping jacks or practice slow, controlled breathing to shift your state. These small physical interventions can alter neurochemistry enough to lower the initial hurdle of inertia. Additionally, paying attention to posture can make a difference. Slouching in a chair with shallow breathing often correlates with a lower energy state. By deliberately sitting upright, relaxing the shoulders, and taking fuller breaths, you signal your body that you are prepared for action, which can slightly increase adrenaline and dopamine release. These adjustments might seem trivial, but over a long day or week, they accumulate to substantially reduce the difficulty of self-regulation. The conversation also addresses how environment impacts physiological readiness. Working in a space that's too warm can make you sleepy, while excessive noise can be distracting. Conversely, a slightly cooler environment can promote wakefulness, and using noise-canceling headphones or white noise can help you tune into your task more effectively. These tweaks are essentially about aligning external conditions with your internal goals. When it comes to discipline, it's beneficial to think holistically. If you rely solely on brute willpower while ignoring environmental and physiological factors, you're leaving a lot of potential support on the table. By syncing your environment, breath, posture, and daily routines, you lighten the cognitive load required to stay disciplined, allowing you to spend more of your mental energy on meaningful tasks rather than fighting basic biological impulses. The conversation around caffeine evolves into a practical protocol for those wanting to maximize its performance-enhancing effects. If you consume caffeine every single day at relatively high doses, you may lose the heightened benefits because your body adapts and you end up using caffeine just to ward off withdrawal symptoms. One strategy is to taper down your caffeine intake over a period of a few days, then possibly take a short break of 1 or 2 days with zero caffeine. After such a reset, when you return to your usual dose or slightly higher, you're likely to feel a pronounced lift in focus and physical energy. The challenge is that tapering or quitting can trigger symptoms of withdrawal, like headaches, low mood, or fatigue. The conversation suggests that if you do it gradually, cutting your intake by 10 or 15% each day for a week, the withdrawal effects can be more manageable. This cyclical approach mirrors the theme of random reinforcement and layered dopamine. You are intentionally modifying your baseline so that when you up the ante, the effect is genuinely noticeable. It's reminiscent of how an athlete might rotate through different training intensities to avoid plateaus. Similarly, strategic use of caffeine keeps your neurological system responsive rather than desensitized. The discussion reiterates that there's nothing inherently wrong with consistent, moderate daily caffeine intake, especially if it doesn't compromise your sleep or mental well-being. Some people thrive with a predictable morning coffee routine. However, if you want to tap into the performance-boosting aspects of caffeine, a cyclical or strategic approach may serve you better than continuous, unregulated consumption. Again, we see how discipline is not only about forging ahead blindly, but also about planning your resource management, caffeine being one of those resources. By applying foresight and restraint in your caffeine habits, you can preserve the potency of that tool and avoid the common pitfall of diminishing returns. Throughout the conversation, a recurring principle is the notion of toggling between intense action and deliberate rest. This is not just about managing your dopamine or your caffeine intake. It's about structuring your entire day, week, and life in a way that respects your biological rhythms. Many people who burn out do so not because they're unwilling to work hard, but because they never truly unplug from work or stress. They live in a constant state of mild arousal, which is exhausting and blunts creativity and drive. By contrast, individuals who have mastered discipline tend to have clear boundaries. They might work intensely for defined blocks of time, then consciously shift to a recovery activity, be it exercise, a hobby time with family, or a meditative practice. Huberman underscores that high achievers in many fields, from sports to academia to entrepreneurship, often share this pattern. They are not necessarily working 20 hours a day. Rather, they maximize the quality of the hours they do work. The conversation suggests that the skillful use of discipline involves knowing when to scruff yourself into action, like an animal mother lifting her pup by the scruff, and when to let go. Interestingly, letting go can sometimes be the harder skill to learn for those who pride themselves on their relentless drive. However, ignoring the need for rest is counterproductive. The brain doesn't form new connections optimally if you never give it space to recuperate. In short, discipline can be seen as managing the dial on your own nervous system, turning up the adrenaline when it's time to push, and actively choosing to power down when it's time to recover. This is easier said than done because many people either push too long or relax too often. Balancing the seesaw is a skill acquired through trial, error, and self-awareness. By drawing all these threads together, we can see that discipline is not a mysterious force reserved for the select few who are naturally driven. Rather, it is a learnable process, grounded in tangible biological and psychological mechanisms. Limbic friction is that initial resistance we encounter whenever we step outside our comfort zone, and top-down control is the means by which we override it. Dopamine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine are chemical allies in our quest to focus, train, and push ourselves, provided we use them wisely and allow for necessary reset periods. Random reinforcement and the strategic layering or withholding of rewards help keep our motivational systems from becoming stagnant or desensitized. Managing or cycling our caffeine intake can further fine-tune our daily energy profile. Coupled with practices like NSDR short naps and gap learning, we can literally accelerate the pace at which our brains adopt new skills and knowledge. Above all, restful, consistent sleep remains the bedrock that sustains discipline over the long haul. A significant takeaway is the transformative power of anticipating a future win. Whether you prefer to summon positive or negative emotions, the act of forging a believable link between the present struggle and a meaningful reward changes the game. It turns seemingly impossible tasks into stepping stones towards something personally valuable. This sense of personal value is crucial. If the reward is not genuinely compelling to you, dopamine will be in short supply and friction will feel insurmountable. Finally, discipline emerges as more than just trying harder. It is about shaping your environment, structuring your day, and learning to modulate internal states. When deployed skillfully, discipline becomes a positive feedback loop. Small wins reinforce your belief in your ability to act, leading to more wins and ultimately a baseline identity of someone who sees friction as a challenge to be overcome, rather than an impenetrable wall. At the end of the day, mastering self-discipline isn't about pushing harder, it's about working smarter. These surprisingly simple yet powerful habits, from managing caffeine intake to taking strategic mini breaks, can unlock new levels of energy focus and personal satisfaction. By tuning into your body's natural rhythms and tweaking your environment, you gain not just discipline, but true enjoyment and fulfillment in your everyday life. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Which of these tips resonated most with your own experiences? Do you have personal strategies that have dramatically boosted your productivity or improved your quality of life? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let's start a lively conversation. And remember, your journey toward a more balanced, purposeful, and energized life is just beginning. Hit subscribe and let's continue exploring meaningful ways to thrive together.